Hello, I'm Wendy. Today we're painting coastal walls in watercolour and it's a tutorial. A few weeks ago I visited Skomer Island off the south coast of Pembrokeshire in Wales. I've done a video before of the little flowers that were on the wall, and I'll give you a link to that in the description. And I've also got a blog telling you a little bit about the island with one or two more paintings, so you might want to have a look at that. And again, there's a link in the description box below. I was really drawn to the little flowers, the sea campion, that was growing all over these walls and along the rocky shoreline. But I was also really interested in the walls themselves because, well, you can see, can't you? Just look at the patterns and the texture and the colours. And if you're a watercolourist and you like painting texture and doing some experimenting, then this really is an ideal subject. And I should be looking at producing some of these textures and some of these shapes in the video today. This is a tutorial and I shall be explaining some of the techniques in a fair amount of detail. I'm hoping that if you can see the way that I work and if you like the way that I work, then you'll get some ideas for producing some of your own paintings. You can go out and you can find your own bits of wall. They've not got to be on the coast, clearly. There's some lovely rustic walls in the countryside. So you are free to download this image if you want to use it, but please be aware of copyright, and they are stipulated in the description box below the video. There is a link there showing you how you can download this image if you do wish to. I started out doing a sketch of some of the shapes on the wall, not copy them exactly, but just sort of picking out the ones that I liked. I'm working on Saunders Waterford paper, £140 knot surface, as I usually do. I'm just going to be using the watercolour and splattering work and using a small brush and splattering with water as well, but I'm not going to be using any granulation fluid, and I'm going to be using very minimal salt and also using smaller brushes for detail work. I started off by putting on some colour to represent a sort of sky above the rocky wall. I set off not to actually paint a picture, it was just a study of the wall, but you'll see I did add, I couldn't resist adding a few more details towards the end of the video. But this is the area now for the sky, and I'm just putting a very light grey wash on there, mixed with something like ultramarine and burnt sienna. I did the drawing with a charcoal pencil, and I've been using charcoal pencils with watercolour quite a lot recently. If you don't like using the charcoal or you're just not used to it, then use a regular pencil as well. I quite like the way that the charcoal goes along with the watercolour and you get this sort of merging of marks. I looked at the colour of the stones in the wall and put some very light washes on. There were greys and some little bits of yellow in there. So this would be the first layer I put on. It's very easy to make those white, very light rocks in there, stones I mean, too dark. So be very careful at this stage and put it on really lightly and leave some of the, well, I find it best to leave some of the white showing just as the white watercolour paper, and then I put a few more marks here and there. Did a little bit of splattering just to keep the whole thing loose. Try not to get too tight with it. I sometimes splatter just plain water over, or you could spray it a little bit. And then what I normally do then is use the lightest colour that I can see and pop that on, mainly sort of all over that area, painting around the stones in the wall and also leaving some odd bits of white here and there. There was quite a lot of orange in the wall, so I dotted that in places. And as you can see, I'm working mainly wetted to wet at this stage, letting the colours run into each other, and then looking at some of the areas where you've got the darker tones in there and putting those in. Again, doing the occasional splattering and trying to keep the whole thing as loose as you can. You're not really having a lot of preconception, if you like, of what this is going to look like. You're working quite intuitively and popping the paint on there. And at this stage, as I said, just working it wet into wet and letting the colours run together. It's quite an experimental way of working, but you are keeping some control because you're keeping those stones nice and light. And what I do is continually look at your photograph, but without copying it. Just find areas that you like and maybe reproduce those on your painting. And if you like something in the photograph, then it's not got to go in exactly the same place. You can put it in a different place. And if you like it, then you can repeat it. You can put it in other parts of the painting. It's being, I suppose, quite creative in an experimental way. You're being experimentally creative, let's put it that way, and not being too bothered about the outcome necessarily, but just enjoying putting the paint on and getting these nice colours to run together. Now at this stage we could add some more mediums to the picture. I think I mentioned before you can use granulation medium, which makes the paint granulate to get the textures. You could have put something like a bit of candle wax on first, you could sprinkle salt on, but I'm keeping this very simple. This is a tutorial especially for beginners, and what you're doing here is just basically using your watercolours, water and your brush. So you don't need to worry about any of the mediums, but certainly look into them and do experiment with them. So here I'm continuing to add the darks. I think as a beginner particularly you might find mixing the darks quite difficult, but don't be afraid to mix them really thick. And when you put them on, don't spread the darks around, just put them on in one place, reload your brush and put them on again. And that's one of the ways that you can maintain the darks without them drying back too light. Good darks here would be ultramarine with burnt sienna, possibly a little bit of light red, and you can always pop a touch of Payne's grey in there as well. I'm adding a tiny bit of salt here. It made very little difference, but I just put a small sprinkling of it on there. It was all very, very wet and a bit puddly, so I just sort of lifted the paper and let the paint sort of mix a little bit more. You tend to get granulation by doing this as well, which is all to the good when you're working like this. So this was a wall study, but I couldn't resist putting a few bits of green on there. There were little, in the photograph there's flowers and there's this little greenery on top, and so I just put a bit of green on there with the brush, using maybe a bit of sap green, some cobalt blue with a little bit of yellow, varying the tones so you get a few darks in there. Again, keeping it as loose as you can, just letting the brush sort of dot around. And I put some of the green also below because there were suggestions of plants growing and greenery in the wall. Now when that first stage of the painting was dry, I used a very small brush and I did some detail work just to suggest the texture and the things that were growing in the soil between the stones. I could have finished that at any sort of stage really. I mean, I could have finished it now, but I carried on a bit, and this is some splattering going on as well with the very dark paint. I think at this stage I just enhance the greenery a little bit as well, just to balance the tones. You have to sort of stand back from it and have a good look and balance the tones as you go along. The stones were too white, so I went back and put some darker tones on them. I had a look at the photograph carefully and picked out some of the colours that were on there. You can soften some of the edges if you feel they're all a little bit too hard edged and stand out a little bit too much. Use a very, very damp brush on one or two of the edges to soften them. I used a rigger brush to do a little bit of detail work, putting in a little bit more of the greens that I saw there, and also a few darks just in places around the stones. And then a final little bit of splatter on them. I introduced a small amount of a very dilute wash of blue on some of the areas on the wall. It can suggest shadow, give you a little bit of form on them, and is a nice contrast to the other colours that were in there. And I think the little bit of blue works quite nicely. I think a little bit of splatter with a very light colour, in this case I'm using white gouache, always enhances the feeling of texture in a painting like this, and I really like to use it. Not to be overdone, which you can do, but I think this was looking quite nice and made a bit of a difference. And at this stage then I was trying to work out the composition of the painting, and I do this sometimes by putting these pieces of paper around it. I didn't like, well, I know it was a study of a wall and I could have left it, but I really had to turn it into some sort of little picture, and I didn't like that area of blue, that oblong, if you like, of blue at the top there. So I broke it up with some more foliage, again just dotting the brush around with some of the same green on there and varying the tones a little bit. I did a little bit more on the right hand side as well, just working in the same way. And I felt the bottom was a little bit too light. It needed warming up a bit. There was a lot of warmth in the wall, so I just put a little bit of that warm burnt sienna colour there. So the study of the wall really was finished, but I felt I wanted to do a little bit more, and I'm using the charcoal pencil just to put some marks on there, because I have got other marks of charcoal on there, and I just wanted to put a little bit more on just to make it a bit more cohesive, dotting it around and maybe doing a few lines. You could see some very, very faint lines in the stones there on the wall and in the wall. So I just put a few of those in and did a little bit on the stones themselves. I just quite like doing this sort of work, just keeping an eye on your reference and just seeing things in there that you can put onto your painting without being too contrived and without it being too controlled. And I quite like putting these pencil lines across it. I wasn't terribly happy with the composition until I put that barbed wire, which I thought when I took the photograph, oh, that's a bit ugly, isn't it? But when I came to paint it, I felt it was a nice little feature on there, so I just used a little bit of light red and I put the barbed wire on there. I rather liked it in the end. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video and that you learned something from it and can use some of the techniques in your own paintings. Don't forget that I do have a Facebook group and you can put your paintings in there. It would be really nice to see what you've been doing and how you've been interpreting some of the things that we've been talking about and doing today. You may have noticed I called this video part 1. Well, I am putting together another video. I'm doing a larger picture and I'm incorporating this sort of work and also putting the sea campion flowers on it as well. If you haven't done so already, then do subscribe to my channel and you won't miss that or anything else that I'm doing in the future. Bye for now and happy painting.